Welcome back to the Rational Nationalist. This week we began looking ahead to the 2028 election, presenting a prisoner's dilemma model that indicates, looking simply at game theory and assuming both parties nominate in a rational manner, why it seems more than likely that a more moderate, less belligerent nominee will win at least one of the two parties' nominations, and going on to win the presidency seems like the most solid prediction. Today, we'll look at everything that's wrong with that model and whether or not it's practically useless. After all, the simplified model presented by this week's graphic can't really even properly be called a model. It's literally the same electability argument that gets made every 4 years in presidential primaries and countless other times in every other election, basically ever. The thinking is simplistic to the point of absurdity, ignoring pretty much everything but the most rudimentary logic. It's basically the political equivalent of picking the bigger dog in the fight. How valid are predictions or forecasts made based on such overly simplified thinking compared to predictions made by pundits or other experts, both real and so-called, who consider things like the state of the economy, historic trends, and anything other than candidate choice? They're surprisingly valid. In fact, simple models often prove superior, even far superior, to more complicated ones. When making predictions, often less is more. Adding variables or factors of consideration only muddies the water, obscuring the one or two underlying causes that are really driving the outcomes you're trying to predict. In this episode, we'll begin to forecast the 2028 election. Maybe we can steal from ESPN's college football polls and call this our, quote, way too early election forecast. And we'll go into it in more detail than Tuesday, examining how this age-old prisoner's dilemma faced by each party every 4 years is likely to play out this time, as well as some less likely scenarios. In the process, we'll make some general points about forecasting that can be applied in all facets of life whenever you have to make a prediction, starting with distinguishing between probabilistic and deterministic predictions. The first problem with the predictions provided by our prisoner dilemma model is that the outcomes are definite, which is almost certainly not the case. In other words, the model is telling us that every moderate will defeat every extreme candidate all the time. But look at all the good nominating the moderate candidates did the Republicans in 2008 or 2012, or the Democrats in 2016, for example. In fact, 2016 is an almost perfect repudiation of our model. If you recall, Trump was widely considered the far-right candidate, so far out of the mainstream that former candidate Mitt Romney urged Republicans to reject Trump, before Romney later embraced Trump, before Romney then decided to reject Trump yet again. When you allow personal drama to impact your politics, it becomes a roller coaster, though reality TV-like atmosphere is par for the course in the Trump era. The Democrats faced a choice, supposedly they had a choice, between Hillary Clinton, representing Obama's third term, something only achieved by Reagan in the modern era, against the more extreme far-left Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders. The DNC nominated Clinton, meaning the Democrats should have won that election vis-a-vis our prisoner's dilemma model. For anyone who doesn't remember the history, that's not what happened that November. Does that mean the model is useless? I guess that depends on if you think candidate choice matters. There's a very real argument it matters less and less, to the point of being practically irrelevant, which I would think we'd all find concerning, as it's one of the reasons many of the founders were skeptical of parties. But no, the prisoner's dilemma model we drew is not completely and totally useless. Rather, it was never intended to be absolutely deterministic. That would be stupid. Instead, it was meant to indicate a general tendency of the general election to lean toward more moderate candidates. If this wasn't made clear by the graphic, and since I made the graphic, well, with some refinement from AI, I know that the graphic didn't make this clear, but that is what I'm telling you about this model now. What the model was intended to do was depict the strategic choice faced by the GOP and Democrats going into 2028 in as simple, practical terms as possible by boiling an extremely complex system, presidential elections, 50 independent state elections in which 300 million plus individuals, all with their own motives, desires, and misconceptions, make 300 million different quasi-independent decisions, and to take this complex system and put it into a grid that can be understood and applied in a matter of seconds. This is the point of all models, from our prisoner's dilemma model to basic supply and demand curves to advanced econometrics or election models like those devised by Nate Cohn and Nate Silver. The point is to take a complex, chaotic system and simplify it so that it makes sense to the human mind. And, of course, in many cases, these models are used to produce forecasts and make predictions. For example, if we tried to predict the individual behavior of all 300, 400, whatever million number of voters exist in America at this point, we wouldn't know how to begin. Models allow us to take an incomprehensible amount of information and boil it down into something that's usable, either simplifying it into a prisoner's dilemma or a supply and demand, or going the other way and constructing a more complicated computer model as seen in Nate Silver's election predictions that consider so many variables that they require computers to run and yet are still simplified versions of reality. As seen with the prisoner's dilemma model, these models can be used to make predictions or forecasts, which for now we're using more or less synonymously, though we will differentiate them in a touch, albeit slightly. As also demonstrated by retroactively applying our prisoner's dilemma model to 2016, the predictions these models yield aren't always accurate. However, that doesn't mean they're useless. Let's go back a step and start by differentiating a prediction from a forecast. Now, this isn't necessarily a commonly accepted distinction, though I don't think it overly deviates from common usage. Essentially, when I say prediction, I mean something deterministic. That is something like saying AOC will be the next president. A forecast is essentially a probabilistic prediction delivered with a lot less certainty, covering the full range of possible outcomes with approximate odds in favor of each. Think of something like the weather. Sometimes they say expect sunny skies or stormy weather, but more often than not they'll give odds or percentages. In other words, predictions as we're using it are absolute. And only a Sith speaks in absolutes. Needless to say, in my opinion, anybody who ever makes an absolute deterministic statement ever is a complete and total idiot, and you should always ignore what they say. In seriousness, however, predictions are best left for when you have to make a choice. That is, somebody asks specifically for a single prediction, and even then should be qualified by the confidence you have in said prediction, signified statistically by margins of error or confidence intervals. For human predictions, it's usually sufficient to simply acknowledge the degree of uncertainty one has in their prediction. Forecasts, like the weather, are probabilistic, acknowledging a range of possible outcomes and more detailed accounting of their relative likelihoods, such as when they say there's likely sunny skies, 70% chance, but with a 30% chance of thunderstorms. These tend to be much more useful and much more accurate than predictions, though ultimately, of course, both boil down more to the process used to obtain the result. Why, then, does there seem to be more of a market for clear predictions than ambiguous forecasts? For the same reason people used to throw chicken bones and some still visit psychics. Certainty, even the false sense of it, creates comfort. We know that we don't know, but we like to think that somebody else does, and we can rest easily knowing that we live in an orderly, predictable universe that at least somebody can make sense of. It's also the reason that in life the biggest asshole often wins. People who are willing to ignore doubt, ambiguity, facts, or are simply too stupid to question themselves are more certain of their predictions. Thus, they themselves come across as more confident, stronger, and smarter, all traits that people are naturally drawn to, even though it's all based on nothing but King Asshole's unrealistic self-assessment of his own abilities. However, there are less nefarious reasons for people to prefer certainty in predictions and forecasts other than the everybody else is stupid explanation. You should probably be a little skeptical of dismissive explanations like that in general, such as God did it or people are stupid, because even when that is the case, there's still usually an underlying reason for such stupidity, or I guess an underlying physical mechanism by which God did it. Probabilistic interpretations and predictions are much, much more difficult to work with. Anyone who has ever played chess or worked with probability trees knows how quickly even having two options can become after several iterations. Definite predictions are easier to work with, and since the ultimate goal of any model is to simplify complexity to the point of manageability, or to dumb things down to the point that they make sense, rather than our brains just seeing a mumble of data or numbers, as anybody who's ever seen a scatter plot without a regression line can sympathize with, and as such, are more useful to work with than the raw data. They also make more sense to the primitive evolutionary parts of the brain. This is especially true in events such as the Super Bowl or presidential elections that, by definition, only have one outcome. For example, predicting Hillary Clinton has a 75% chance of beating Donald Trump does no good unless you have at least 4 elections against which to weigh that prediction, and even then, random chance will have more influence on the outcome than the odds. You'd need to have the election 100 times or more to test the model accurately. In the real world, Donald Trump may have only had a 25% chance of winning, but when that coin came up heads twice, he won 100% of the presidency. For this reason, predictions that Donald Trump would win look prescient in retrospect, even though they were probably, in my opinion, feel free to disagree, little more than lucky guesses. Now, this next part can get abstract and philosophical pretty quickly, and I'd like to keep it concrete and tied to earth, but first I want to go into one more philosophical foray that anyone familiar with Laplace's demon, apologies if I'm butchering the French, understands. We know that Donald Trump won the election. However, does that mean he was always destined to win? Are the models giving Hillary Clinton a chance to win all wrong? In other words, could an omniscient being In this case, we'll replace being with model. With perfect knowledge of all the facts, with complete precision, and an absolute understanding of how these variables interact, make perfect predictions. The answer comes down to whether you believe we live in a deterministic or probabilistic universe, a question that's as interesting as it is unprovable and unimportant. To me, quantum physics implies that the universe itself is probabilistic, but it doesn't really matter one way or the other. Whether hampered by our own human limitations or the nature of the universe itself, we can't know every variable in interaction perfectly, especially in chaotic systems that involve a lot of complex interactions between their moving parts. All we can do is isolate the most relevant factors and model the system the best we can. This is where models like our prisoner's dilemma chart or supply and demand come in handy. They cut through the noise and isolate one or two key variables. In the case of our prisoner's dilemma model, candidate choice. By ignoring all other factors impacting electoral outcomes, or economic outcomes in supply and demand's case, and focusing on the most important variables, we can make models that are actually useful as opposed to simply shrugging your shoulders or going with your gut, which actually in a lot of ways is probably your mind doing or attempting to do this with varying degrees of reliability automatically. How do we know which variables to focus on? That's the problem. We don't always know. This is where forecasting and predictions take on an art form, and some people's guts or intuitions seem to work better than others. They know what variables are actually important and which only appear important. Rationally, we can do some experimentation and use some judgment. Probably candidate choice is more important than election day weather, but even this hypothesis is difficult to test or verify. Worse, these variables play into each other in complex and unpredictable ways, in the same way a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil can cause a tornado in Texas. Remember how we said that candidate choice mattered more than election day weather? Well, for anyone unfamiliar with chaos theory, the whole butterfly metaphor comes from the fact that weather is a chaotic system like the political election system. Small changes in one variable in one part of the system impacts another part of the system, generally in an exponential way, which in turn impacts another part of the system, and so on. This was originally discovered in weather forecasting, when a truncated input changed the predicted weather in Paris from sunny to stormy. Simply rounding off one seemingly unrelated number created significantly different outcomes, such that theoretically a butterfly flapping its wings could cause a slight change in wind speeds in Brazil, which would affect barometric pressure or whatever other thing wind speed impacts. I know nothing about meteorology, but it impacts something over the Atlantic Ocean, which would impact some other meteorological term, and so on, until you eventually get a tornado in Texas. In fact, although most would agree that weather months before an election is generally an unimportant factor to consider, when you think about the Butler assassination attempt and what would have happened if the wind had pushed the bullet just an inch the other way, it's possible that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil was a key factor in the outcome of the 2024 election. The point of all this is that definite predictions are a fool's game, even if the universe is deterministic and it is theoretically possible to predict the future. And when making forecasts, we have to consider a wide range of possibilities, from sunny skies to thunderstorms, and examine the conditions that might produce them. Anyone interested in further reading should check out Phil Tetlock's work on super forecasters or pick up Nate Silver's Signal in the Noise, which discuss this in much greater detail. Alright, so let's get our feet back on the ground a little here and return to the immediate issue, which is forecasting the 2028 election. I do think our prisoner's dilemma model provides a good jumping off point. However, there are all sorts of qualifications and so on that we're kind of using jumping off point the way Frank Reynolds did in Always Sunny. I do think that it is likely a mainstream or moderate candidate will ultimately prevail. As much as political pundits like to obsess over minutiae, the prevailing winds tend to carry the day, which is why some of the most successful models boil down to a few key, often economic indicators. The incentives provided by our prisoner's dilemma model blow each party towards less extreme choices. Incentives drive behavior, as Charlie Munger emphasized. We've talked about on this show how gerrymandered districts have incentivized polarity. However, these perverse incentives don't apply at the presidential level, where candidates must worry about both the primary and the general election. The fact that this doesn't seem to have influenced recent history is inconsequential. The past few primary elections have been unique, given Trump's decade-long dominance of the GOP and the DNC's engineering of the past three primary results on the Democratic side. Now, I'm about to commit the political pundit version of invading Russia in the winter and predict or forecast, since I think it's still unlikely, maybe a 10% chance, of a successful third-party bid. Maybe it's my personally libertarian leanings, but it seems every 4 years people predict this, and every 4 years they end up looking like fools. However, assuming both parties nominate extremists, say AOC versus a non-literal Trump third term represented by J.D. Vance, assuming J.D. Vance hasn't schismed from Trump at this point, you see what I'm saying about the contingencies quickly adding up. As has been the recent habit of both parties, I think the odds are now much closer to 1 in 4 or even 1 in 3, again, of a successful third-party candidacy, assuming both major parties nominate partisan extremists. If the current trajectory continues, with the Democrats' approval at an all-time low, you now have a historical number of Americans dissatisfied with both parties, and that number now rivals support for the parties themselves. Traditionally, even with unpopular presidents and opposition parties, such as during the Obama administration, approval for both still drifts around 40%, give or take 5%, and that 5% is mostly coming on the upper end of 40. That means about 80% is happy with at least one choice, leaving 20% universally unhappy. Currently, Democratic approval is about 1 in 3, and Trump's approval just dipped below 40%. If the Democrats remain unpopular and Trump's approval continues to slide to around 35%, you are now approaching around 30% who are unhappy with both parties, rivaling the amount of support for both parties individually. You have 30% still are okay with the Republicans, 30% willing to tolerate the Democrats, and 30% who are just pissed off at everybody. At this point now, the numbers start working towards pulling people from the parties on the polls to the center, instead of pulling people from the center party to the polls, as has traditionally happened to most other third-party candidates, such as Ross Perot. Furthermore, a major historical hitch of third parties is that nobody can agree on what type of third party they want. Outside the major tent parties, You have people like socialists and communists to the left of the Democrats, and Nazis, white supremacists, and others to the right of the Republicans. Then you have people in the middle, so even though the majority may want a third party, they can never really agree on that party's platform. This time, however, the Democrats have essentially become a Marxist left party, as evidenced by the dominance of candidates like Mamdani, Platner, and in our extremist successful third party hypothetical, Democratic nominee AOC. The Republicans are essentially the same win-at-all-costs, strongman-centric MAGA party represented by some metaphoric or literal Trump third term, likely nominating J.D. Vance, though the exact candidates aren't particularly important. This provides enough common ground for a third party. Constitutionalism. A willingness to put aside personality disputes to focus on the well-being of the American people and strengthening the American nation is really all it takes at this point. No more censorship, no more gerrymandering, no more stacking courts, and no more lawfare. Essentially, a normie candidate who rejects both Biden's open borders and Trump's crackdowns for a common sense policy, or one who focuses more on economic realities than socialist ideology or big ticket projects and tax cuts, would now have enormous middle ground to work with. What I'm saying is that in the what I still consider to be unlikely event that we do get another shouting match between two extremists, the math for a third party now works. Whether the logistics can come together, however, is another issue, and we still have a significant chance that the 2028 election will ultimately yield another aggressive partisan at the helm getting elected president, with the potentially dangerous, divisive consequences for the nation that would follow. Thank you for joining us on the Rational Nationalist. I've been your host, Lee Ellis, signing off.